The grand concert hall buzzed with energy, filled with a crowd eager for entertainment, discussion, and perhaps a little controversy. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, a mix of admiration and skepticism directed toward the woman who had taken center stage. Dressed in an elegant yet understated ensemble, she carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to scrutiny, but unfazed by it. The event was meant to be a night of music and conversation, but it was quickly turning into something more, a test, a challenge that no one had anticipated. The audience, a blend of high-profile guests, journalists, and casual attendees, had gathered for what they expected to be an evening of engaging discourse. Yet, an air of condescension hung over a certain section of the room. A few smirks exchanged, whispers just audible enough to signal that some were waiting for a moment to exploit. The conversation had started with the usual back and forth, policy, law, leadership, but it took a sudden turn when a suggestion was made, a challenge posed. The question wasn't meant as an invitation. It was a jab wrapped in politeness, an attempt to expose supposed inadequacy. She had been asked about music, an interest she rarely spoke of in public. The moment the topic surfaced, the expressions around the room shifted. Amusement flickered in the eyes of those who doubted her capabilities outside of a courtroom. There was a game being played, a subtle maneuver to put her in an uncomfortable position. After all, what did she know about artistry, about refinement beyond legal battles? It was an old trick. Find an area where someone is assumed to be inexperienced, and put them on the spot. The request was simple on the surface. Would she take a seat at the piano and play? The tone, though, carried an unspoken message. Surely she wouldn't dare. Surely this would expose her limitations. There were those in the crowd who leaned forward, sensing an impending moment of amusement at her expense. Some even exchanged quiet chuckles, ready to witness the unraveling of someone they perceived as out of their element. But rather than hesitate, she simply smiled. Not a forced, uneasy smile, but one of quiet confidence. The kind of smile that suggested she knew something they didn't. She glanced at the polished grand piano at the center of the stage, its glossy black surface reflecting the dim lighting above. Without a word, she walked toward it, her heels clicking lightly against the floor. The room stilled. This wasn't the reaction they had expected. Sliding onto the bench with effortless grace, she placed her hands on the keys, fingers brushing the smooth ivory as if reacquainting herself with an old friend. The crowd, momentarily hushed, still carried an undertone of skepticism. Surely this was nothing more than a bluff, an attempt to deflect, to stall. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself, a certainty in her posture that suggested otherwise. Then she played. The first notes rang out, delicate yet commanding. There was no hesitation, no fumbling for placement or rhythm. The melody unfolded with breathtaking precision, cascading across the room like a wave of unexpected brilliance. The conversations that had been whispered in quiet amusement were now silenced entirely. Every head turned toward her, eyes widening as realization sank in. The composition was complex, intricate in its execution. This was not the hesitant attempt of an amateur. It was the performance of someone who understood music not just technically, but emotionally. Each note resonated with intention, with depth, with a fluency that only came from years of practice. The hands that had so often been seen gripping legal documents, gesturing persuasively in court, now moved across the keys with effortless elegance. Expressions shifted from bemusement to astonishment. Those who had smirked before now sat motionless, their earlier amusement replaced with disbelief. A few glanced at one another, as if to confirm that they were, in fact, witnessing what they thought they were. The melody continued, swelling into a passage so intricate that even trained musicians in the room recognized the level of mastery required to execute it. Time seemed to stretch, the air thick with an almost tangible sense of awe. No one had expected this. They had expected hesitation, failure, an awkward moment of exposure. Instead, they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied every assumption they had walked in with. And still, she played. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that spoke of years spent in quiet devotion to the craft. The melody was not hesitant or timid, but rich with depth and confidence, weaving an intricate tapestry of sound that filled the grand hall. Each note resonated with a clarity that demanded attention, drawing in even those who had initially dismissed the moment as little more than a spectacle. The piece she chose was no simple tune meant to impress with flashy, surface-level dexterity. It was one that required both technical mastery and emotional depth, a composition that revealed the heart of the player just as much as their skill. It began softly, a delicate cascade of notes that rolled like a whisper across the room, catching the audience off guard. Conversations had stopped entirely. The smug expressions that had lingered in certain corners of the hall were wiped away, replaced by something else, genuine intrigue. The music grew in intensity, her hands moving with an ease that suggested not just talent, but years of discipline. There was no hesitation, no searching for the right key, only an effortless flow from one passage to the next. The movement of her fingers was as natural as breathing, as if she had played this piece 1,000 times before. The richness of the chords, the fluidity of her transitions, it was undeniable. She was not merely playing. She was commanding the music, shaping it with a confidence that left no room for doubt. The audience, now fully entranced, sat frozen. What had begun as an unspoken challenge had turned into something entirely different. Whispers of mockery had turned to hushed, gasps of astonishment. Some leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something bordering on admiration. Others simply stared, their assumptions crumbling with each passing note. It wasn't just the skill that left them stunned, it was the sheer artistry behind it. Every crescendo, every decrescendo was deliberate. She knew when to let the music soar, when to hold back, when to allow silence to stretch just long enough to create anticipation before plunging forward into another wave of melody. There was no excess, no wasted motion. It was precise, disciplined, yet undeniably expressive. The piece transitioned into a more demanding section, a whirlwind of intricate phrasing that required complete control. The kind of passage that could expose even a well-trained pianist if they lacked the necessary mastery. But there was no struggle in her playing, only an unwavering confidence. The music poured from her, effortless yet powerful, filling every corner of the room with a presence that could not be ignored. For some in the audience, the moment carried an almost poetic irony. She was known for her sharp mind, her relentless tenacity in the courtroom, her ability to dismantle arguments with precision. But here, at the piano, she was revealing something entirely different, an artistry that few had ever suspected. It was a reminder, a lesson unfolding in real time, that people were never as one-dimensional as others might assume. Her hands glided into the final movement, a section that demanded both technical brilliance and emotional depth. It was the kind of ending that left no room for ambiguity, one that would either solidify her mastery or expose any lingering doubt. But there was no hesitation, no wavering. She brought the piece to its climax with breathtaking control, each note ringing out with unwavering clarity. And then, just as effortlessly as it had begun, the music softened. The rapid intensity gave way to a final lingering phrase, delicate yet purposeful. The last note hovered in the air, resonating long after her fingers had left the keys. Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable silence of expectation, but the stunned, weighty stillness that only comes when an audience has been truly moved. The final note lingered in the air, a soft yet resounding echo that settled over the room like the last flicker of a candle before darkness. The stillness that followed was profound. There was no immediate reaction, no polite applause, no scattered murmurs, only silence, thick and heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. It was the kind of silence that could only exist when expectations had been utterly shattered. The expressions in the audience told the story better than any words ever could. Eyes widened in disbelief, lips slightly parted, breaths held as if exhaling too soon would break the spell. Some sat with their hands frozen mid-motion, as if they had intended to react but had been caught off guard by the sheer magnitude of what they had witnessed. There had been an assumption, an expectation that this moment would end in quiet embarrassment, in an awkward chuckle and a graceful retreat. Instead, the exact opposite had occurred. The performance had not just proven competence, it had demanded respect. There was no denying it now. This was not the hesitant attempt of someone playing beyond their ability. This was mastery, confidence, a revelation. A single movement in the crowd broke the stillness. Someone shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for confirmation that they weren't alone in their shock. A whispered remark, barely audible, only reinforced what everyone was already feeling. No one had been prepared for this. Then the first clap rang out. A slow, almost hesitant applause from the back of the room, as though the person who started it needed a moment to process what they had just witnessed. Another followed, then another. The sound grew, spreading like ripples in water, until the entire hall was alive with a thunderous ovation. The applause was not merely an obligatory response to a performance. It was charged with something deeper, an acknowledgement, an admission. Those who had smirked earlier now found themselves clapping, with the same hands they had folded in doubt just minutes before. Some who had chuckled quietly now exchanged uncertain glances, realizing that they had grossly underestimated what had just taken place. Still seated at the piano, she remained poised, calm, as if the reaction was merely an afterthought. There was no triumphant grin, no expression of defiance, only a quiet satisfaction that spoke louder than words ever could. This was not about proving something to anyone else. It was simply a demonstration of what had always been there, hidden in plain sight. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. Moments ago, there had been an air of condescension, of quiet amusement at the thought of watching someone stumble. Now that air had been replaced by something else, respect, admiration, and perhaps even a trace of embarrassment among those who had expected a very different outcome. People in the audience whispered to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even laughed, not out of mockery, but out of sheer surprise. The performance had been more than impressive, it had been humbling. The realization settled over the room like a slow dawn. Assumptions had been made, and every single one of them had been wrong. Some clapped with genuine enthusiasm, others with cautious acknowledgement, but all were participating in the same collective realization. What had begun as an opportunity to poke fun had turned into a moment of undeniable brilliance. Even those who had been skeptical could no longer deny what they had seen. The standing ovation was inevitable. It wasn't forced, nor was it led by any single individual. It was organic, a natural response to something that had transcended expectation. One by one, people rose to their feet, their applause growing in intensity until the entire hall was on its feet. She accepted it with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning. There was no need for words, no need for an explanation. The music had spoken for itself, and judging by the stunned expressions throughout the room, it had spoken louder than any argument ever could. As the final waves of applause settled, the weight of the moment lingered in the air, thick with the realization that something truly unexpected had just unfolded. There was no need for words, no grand explanations or defensive rebuttals. The music had been its own argument, undeniable in its eloquence, dismantling every presumption with each perfectly executed note. The expressions in the crowd reflected a silent reckoning, a collective acknowledgement that a lesson had been learned, even if some were reluctant to admit it. She stood slowly, her fingers leaving the keys with a quiet finality, the polished surface of the piano reflecting the faint glow of the stage lights. There was no triumphant smirk, no need to bask in the stunned reactions around her. Her posture remained poised, her expression unreadable, yet there was a quiet certainty in the way she held herself. She had known all along what would happen. She had seen the expectation in their eyes before she even touched the keys. had recognized the smirks, the subtle glances exchanged between those who had assumed they understood the limits of her abilities. But limits were an illusion crafted by those who lacked the curiosity to look deeper. Assumptions were the armor of the comfortable, the safe haven of those who preferred predictable narratives over inconvenient truths. Tonight, those narratives had been shattered, and the silence that followed was not just one of awe, it was one of introspection. Some in the audience shifted uneasily, glancing around as if waiting for someone to interject, to change the subject, to steer the night back into the realm of the expected. But there was no undoing what had just happened. It had been too raw, too real, too powerful to be ignored. There was no clever remark that could erase the music that had filled the hall, no dismissive quip that could rewind the past few minutes and reshape them into something less humbling. A few polite chuckles surfaced from one corner of the room, the nervous kind, as if laughter might soften the sharp edges of embarrassment. Others, however, remained still, locked in their own quiet reflections. How easily they had judged, how quickly they had assumed. It was a reminder, an uncomfortable one, that people were never as simple as they seemed. She let the applause settle, not rushing to fill the space with unnecessary words. Sometimes silence carried more weight than any response ever could. The truth had already been spoken through the music, and there was little else to say. Still, as she stepped away from the piano, she turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the audience, not with arrogance, but with something closer to amusement. The lesson had not been intentional, nor had it been designed to humiliate. It had simply been the natural outcome of misplaced certainty. There was something satisfying about it, not in proving anyone wrong, but in watching realization unfold in real time. How many times had others been underestimated in similar ways? How many assumptions were made daily, casually, without a second thought? Tonight it had been music that revealed the truth, but how often did people dismiss what they did not expect to understand? She took her time, letting the weight of the moment settle before she spoke. When she did, her words were measured, deliberate. There was no need for confrontation, no need to drive the lesson home with force. The point had already been made. A quiet murmur rippled through the audience as her voice broke the silence, calm yet unmistakably firm. There was a slight shift in the atmosphere, not tension, but something else. A newfound respect, perhaps, or the beginnings of humility from those who had walked into the room certain of their own perceptions. She didn't linger on the moment, didn't dwell on the victory. There was nothing to gloat about, nothing to drag out. She had not come here to prove a point, yet somehow one had been made anyway. With a final glance toward the piano, she turned and walked away, leaving the audience with nothing but their thoughts and the echoes of a melody they would not soon forget. As she stepped away from the piano, the air remained thick with the weight of the moment. The audience, still caught between astonishment and quiet reflection, found themselves grappling with the lesson they had just witnessed. This had not been about music alone. It had been about perception, about the quiet danger of underestimating someone based on shallow assumptions. The night had begun with laughter in certain corners of the room, with smirks and unspoken certainty that this moment would belong to those expecting an easy victory. But now, the very people who had exchanged knowing glances sat in silence, their expressions stripped of the arrogance they had worn so confidently before. She had never set out to prove anyone wrong. There had been no grand speech, no demand for acknowledgement, only a simple decision to sit at that piano and let her actions speak for themselves. And that, perhaps, was the most striking part of all. She hadn't needed to argue or justify. She hadn't needed to remind anyone of her capabilities with words. The music had done all of it effortlessly. The applause had eventually faded, but its echo remained, not just in the hall, but in the minds of those who had witnessed the moment unfold. Some would leave humbled, realizing the flaw in their assumptions. Others might cling to their disbelief, unwilling to admit they had been so wrong, but the truth remained unchanged. As she exited the stage, her steps steady and unhurried, she carried with her a quiet satisfaction, not in embarrassing anyone, but in knowing that for at least one evening, people had been forced to reconsider what they thought they knew. And perhaps, just perhaps, the next time they were tempted to judge, to assume, to dismiss someone before truly seeing them, they would remember this night. They would remember the woman who sat down at a piano, played, with undeniable brilliance and left them speechless, not with words.